and welcome to the Bruce channel. I'm Bruce, and wow, just wow. Did you see the James Comey testimony? If you haven't, try to find it online. You can read the full transcript, but what struck me was how genuine he seemed, and you can't quite get that sensation out of a transcript. In his opening statement, he acknowledged that a president can fire an FBI director for any reason or even no reason at all. But you could tell he was more than a little hurt by the statements that the FBI had been poorly led. And though not in the official statement, the president later told the Russians that Comey was a nut job. And that's what I thought was remarkable. The former director certainly would be angry with the president. Maybe justifiably, maybe not. But he never piled on. During the questions from the senators, it was pretty clear. If you didn't know who it was, you didn't recognize the face or the voice, if you didn't know, but you listened, you could tell from the tone of voice whether the senator was Democratic or Republican, from the tone of voice and direction of the questions, and that's what I found remarkable. When the Republicans asked questions, Comey pushed back, if need be, to make his point that he didn't think the president's request to quit investigating Flynn was correct. That's not a surprise, but if a Democratic senator asked a question that might have characterized the president's words or actions in a more negative way, Mr. Comey pushed back against that, too. And you may recall when, this is bizarre, Trump tweeted that Comey better hope there's no tapes. Who doesn't recall that? But it made no sense, still doesn't. But when asked about it, Comey said, "Oh, Lordy, I hope there are tapes." I don't know if there's any tapes or not. But I would bet that if they're already in the present tense, they will become past tense and no one will ever hear them. I saw a t-shirt. "Lordy, I hope there's tapes." There were a lot of questions that he said he couldn't answer in a public forum, but they were meeting in camera, in private, in the afternoon. And oh, to have been a fly on the wall. All right, there were some anniversaries this past week. I probably ought to have mentioned some of them last week. But anyway, apparently I was not thinking clearly. But two of them had as much influence on both the events of the time and the way our world is today. Last Sunday, June 4th, marked the 75th anniversary since the Battle of Midway. And it was remarkable. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, which, remember, nearly knocked out our Pacific Fleet, a smaller naval group led by Admiral Race Bruins defeated a much larger group, including 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that had been on the attack at Pearl: the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, and the Akagi. The thing is, that was the beginning of the end for Japan, because getting materiel, that is the resources to build carriers, and trained pilots to fly planes, and sailors to drive the boats, and mechanics to keep them running. Remember, size-wise and industrial capacity-wise, the U.S. had the advantage that no one else could match. And of course, you likely recall that at Pearl Harbor, when we lost much of the fleet, the aircraft carriers weren't there. Admiral Yamamoto regretted that. He viewed them as vital to getting them out of the way, especially after the famous Jimmy Doolittle bombing raid on Japanese cities, including Japan. And if you haven't seen it, the movie Pearl depicts that raid pretty well. And they had to strip just about everything from the B-25s. They weren't designed to take off a carrier deck. And the challenge was, it was very well shown in the movie Pearl. The raid really didn't accomplish much, except it did shock the Japanese, because they thought they could not be reached by air. And later that became the basis for the terrible fighting on Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal. And they couldn't surrender, because every island they lost brought us closer to having more bombing runs. So Yamamoto wanted to hit the carriers. He didn't think he could do it at Pearl again. He chose Midway. What he didn't know, I'm pretty sure they didn't find out until after the war, we had broken the Japanese code, and thus knew their plans in advance. And that's why, even though Spruance had a smaller force, he was able to take them by surprise and knock out so many ships. Oh, and he had a good deal of luck too, of course. You may have seen the movies based on Herman Wouk's Winds of War novels, Winds of War and War and Remembrance. But if you haven't read the books, you owe it yourself to do that, especially the sequel, War and Remembrance. I'm not suggesting you don't read the first book, but it ends at Pearl Harbor. It's a compelling read, and that's where you learn who the characters are. But the second, I'm not going to read it here, but the chapter that is the Battle of Midway, your hair will stand on end. Tears may make your cheeks glisten. Some of the first planes to arrive, they were flown by pilots who knew they'd scarcely have enough fuel to reach the Japanese ships, never mind getting back. But because they did that, as I recall it forced Yamamoto to order the fighters to change their armaments. So the planes were going up and down the elevators, changing the kind of armaments they had. And then when the next wave of American planes arrived, well, some of the planes were still downstairs and others were up, didn't have the right armaments. So I was kind of lucky. And I iterate, read the book, but if you don't want to invest that much time, whether you purchase or get it from the library, read the chapter on the Battle of Midway. One local note, a Greensboro man, born in Brooklyn, but Morris Fox was one of the code breakers. He was born in Brooklyn, and he told his story to the newspaper in 2009, and I don't know if he's still with us. You know, he'd be like 100 years old, but before the war, he'd worked with IBM, punch cards. And that was not, there weren't a lot of people that did that. So after Pearl Harbor, he joined the Navy, and that skill set was in so much demand, he didn't even go through basic training. They just sent him directly to Washington working with the other code breakers. And everyone there earned a battle star for both the Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea. Of course, if we remember June 4th and Midway, we must remember June 6th and D-Day. The Normandy landing in 1944 was like no other invasion before or since. The last of the big remembrances for it was 3 years ago, and it won't be the last memorial, but it will be the last big one, because surely, we lose World War II vets every day. If they were around 73 years ago, they'd be around 93 today. So the 80th anniversary won't have nearly the same feel to it. And of course, there are lots of books about D-Day. The most detailed is The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan, published 15 years after the fact in 1959. The Longest Day was also turned into a movie, and based on his book, it had dozens and dozens and dozens of well-known actors. John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Henry Fonda, Robert Ryan, Sal Mineo, Peter Lawford, Rod Steiger, so many, many, many more. Sean Connery. Sean Connery was in it. Of course, he's best known for being the first James Bond. But as the first James Bond, he had an archenemy named Goldfinger. Gert Frobe, who played Goldfinger, was also in The Longest Day. And of course, D-Day had good luck things and bad luck things. German General Rommel was away. He was the guy tasked by Hitler to defend the coast, and he was a brilliant general, but the bad weather made him think no attack is coming, and so he visited his family, and he was right. The bad weather did prevent the attack from launching on the 5th. They went the next day. The Allied meteorologists had figured out that it would be clear enough to go. So Ike said, okay, we'll go. Adding to the uncertainty, the Germans weren't sure where we might attack. They knew one was coming. They didn't know where. Calais is the closest point. That made sense. So the German tanks had to position themselves sort of halfway between Normandy and Calais. And the Allies used that. They had wooden and inflated tanks and boats across from Calais. They had General Patton stationed there. His job was to be seen, because if a German spy saw the famous General Patton, that would seem to indicate that's where they're going to launch from. I've mentioned The Longest Day, which is nonfiction, a wonderful novel. Also turns into a movie about D-Day's Eye of the Needle. It's a page-turner, and I won't spoil it, so... Of course, likely the best D-Day movie is Saving Private Ryan. Again, a large and able cast, and it's fiction, but it's a Steven Spielberg film. It opens with the Normandy landing and the intensity of that day, what it must have been like to watch the Higgins boat ramp go down, run down the gangplank, charge into machine gun fire when you're barely more than a kid. I cannot imagine doing that, and yet Thousands of soldiers did. Spielberg's genius was on full display because while I can't imagine doing that, he made me feel what it must have been like. You know, it's like the chapter on the Midway battle by Woke. Your hair will stand on end. If you've seen it, you know that. Once during a speech, Sir Winston Churchill, he was alluding to the Battle of Britain. That was the air war between the British flyers against Hitler's Luftwaffe. And in a speech alluding to that, he said, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." And at the time he said it, that was probably true, but given that the Normandy landing ultimately emancipated Europe, I think it could have been appropriate then to apply it to everyone who participated in the Normandy landing 73 years ago. 3 years ago, when the big anniversary was observed, I learned this bit of trivia. The Higgins boats opened up and the soldiers ran down. It might have looked random, but it wasn't. Everyone on the boat had a place to stand, assigned place to stand, and how they exited the boat was planned in a precise way, almost like running a football play. This is where you go, this is when you go. Finally, and I showed this once before, but I was working in a picture in South Carolina 2 years ago, and the director of photography is a really, really good cameraman. There's so much to know. How to get the look you want, the palette, what lens to use, and he was good. So good that even though he's a partner in a film company, he gets chosen freelance now and again. He's run a camera at the Masters. And it was 3 years ago, either in preparation for or just after the anniversary, he was there running a camera at Normandy, digging on the beach at Normandy. And he uncovered these things. A German cartridge and an American cartridge. On the one, you can see it stamped with the date, or at least the year of manufacture. And this bottle, that is sand from Normandy. How I felt, expressed in one word: reverence. Hey, let me tell you about my book, Shrink. Or wait, I can let others do it. Welcome back. Remember, you can watch all of our previous shows at our Facebook page or at tinyurl.com/Bruce Channel, where you can also subscribe. If you like what you see, subscribe. You can also write to us at the Bruce Channel at yahoo.com. All right, so one other anniversary was this past week. Just over a week after John Kennedy was born on May 29th, another baby was born on June 7th. His arrival didn't so profoundly change the world, and the circumstances were as different from the to-the-manner-born John Kennedy as could have been possible. JFK's dad was a businessman, a banker, movie mogul, ambassador to Great Britain. He went to Harvard. His son went to Harvard. Dean Martin, born Dino Crecchetti in Steubenville, Ohio, was the son of a barber who didn't speak English, and neither did his son until he began school at age 5. JFK was erudite and read constantly. Dean Martin quit school and never read a book again. He became a dealer in a casino. It was, I should point out, an illegal casino. He was a professional boxer at age 16. He fought under the name of Kid Crochet, broke his nose, broke his fingers. Even later, when on stage or dressed in his finest tux, you could still see the broken fingers. He used to tell people that of his 12 bouts, he won all but 11. He worked in a steel mill, and as a singer, at first he called himself Dino Martini, which was sort of cute because there was an opera singer named Nino Martini. But it was when he was in Cleveland. He was singing with band leader Sammy Watkins, And it was Watkins who suggested he go with Dean Martin. He played the old Mounds Club in Cleveland. So did Perry Como, if you're keeping score at home. So did my band a couple of times. They also played at the Howland House Hotel. So did my band a number of times. Later, while living in New York, he and comedian Sonny King shared an apartment. And they were so broke, sometimes they would fight each other bare-knuckled, but they'd sell tickets to the fights. Sonny King is said to have introduced him to Jerry Lewis. And in 1946, the two of them performed together for the first time at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, and it was magic. I never really cared for their act together. But given the times, it was original. No one else was doing anything like it. And they did that for 10 years. But it was like the Beatles. People would line up for blocks to get tickets to their show. They split 10 years later to the day. It was assumed that the comic genius, Jerry Lewis, would be the big star and Dean Martin maybe would have a career. Exactly the opposite. His work in The Young Lions with Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift was solid, and Clift especially gave him acting pointers. He was great in Rio Bravo with John Wayne and Walter Brennan and Ricky Nelson. But what sealed his place in history, entertainment history, the Beatles took over America in 1964. 3 successive appearances on Ed Sullivan, and their various records took number one and held number one, and they took turns being number one. Oftentimes they had the top 3, 4, 5 songs on the charts. In June 1964, the record that took over number one, the record that knocked the Beatles out of number one, Dean Martin.
Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow.
He'd always been cool. Nothing fazed him. His pal Frank Sinatra was a better singer technically. But despite more than one attempt to make Frank Sinatra a TV star, he just didn't have the coolness of Dean. Martin and Lewis had done television. They had summer replacement shows, and it was always highly rated. So after Everybody Loves Somebody, NBC wanted him to do a weekly show. He didn't want to work that hard. They offered him crazy money, maybe $30 million a year. He still didn't want to. But he said, okay, but I'm only coming in 1 day a week. I'm not doing rehearsals. He thought that would put an end to it. And they agreed. And there was a young guy who played instruments and sang back then, and he saw the King of Cool, and he became that guy. Well, no, not exactly, but once heading to a gig, the drummer noticed I had a cold and said, oh, so tonight you're going to sound like Dean Martin with a cold. Later, I finally figured out, sometimes I'm slow, but if someone wanted someone to sound like Dean Martin, they'd probably hire Dean Martin. But I still can sing like that. And in my show, Dinner with the Rat Pack and more, where I sing songs made famous by Sinatra, Dean, and Sammy Davis, and others too, Bobby Darin, Nat Cole, Tony Bennett. I have a ball doing those shows, but it is the Dean Martin ones that maybe I enjoy doing the most.
Stay with me, sway with me.
Life didn't end officially in 1987, but for all intents and purposes, his son, Dean Paul Martin, died. Young Dean loved to fly, had a pilot's license at age 16. He joined the California Air National Guard. He rose to captain, and in 1987, while flying the F-4 Phantom jet fighter, he flew into the side of a mountain. It was during a snowstorm. The Italians have a traditional toast, Sanciani. May you live to 100 years. May you live 100 years. Well, Dean Martin didn't. He died on Christmas Day, 1995. But had he lived to 100, that birthday would have been this week on Wednesday. Cinciani. One other thing about Dean Martin, he loved golf. Loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. It's not possible. He almost loved it as much as my dad did. And so we have to consider this. It is the week of a supreme test of golf. The Masters, so traditional, and it's beautiful. And in its very own way, it's difficult. The British Open can be crazy difficult, but you never know, because especially the links courses, which are next to the ocean, you can have gale force winds. Literally winds hard enough to move the ball on the green. And they're not all that way. They're not always links course. The PGA is the fourth of the majors, and it's just never quite as difficult. But the U.S. Open is, most of the time, set up to require every shot be made well, and if you're off, you pay for it. They make the fairways more narrow, and if you do miss and you're in the rough, sometimes the rough is 6-7 inches tall. Many years, and these are the best players in the world, remember, many years some of the players say, hey, this is not fair, but it is what it is. This year they've chosen a golf course in Wisconsin called Erin Hills. It's first time. It's very different than most U.S. courses. It is designed sort of like a links course. Very, very few trees. I'm looking forward to watching it. One last note. Even if you are not a golf fan, you've probably seen golfer Phil Mickelson in commercials for an arthritis medicine. Phil is one of golf's good guys. Everyone likes him. But the four majors, only 5 golfers have won each one at least once. Gene Sarazen, Ben Hogan, Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods, Gary Player. No Sam Snead, no Arnold Palmer, no Tom Watson, and no Phil Mickelson either. And he's come close to winning the U.S. Open. He hasn't, but he has won all of the other 3 at least once, so it is a given he'd like to join the 5 mentioned. So I just think it's a tremendous mark of character of the man he is inside. He's passing on it this year. He's not going to play. And he turns 47 on Friday, so realistically, how many more chances will he get? But his daughter is graduating high school in California on Sunday, and that's where he will be. So Phil, if you're watching, salute! And may your upcoming week, not only Phil, all of you, may your upcoming week be the best one you've ever had.